Swans or the Pies, which team was more disappointing this weekend?
I think that's a pretty easy answer. It's got to be the Pies. I mean, they were the favourite in that game. I think a lot of people have expected a big bounce back year after what we sort of put down as a premiership hangover 2024. And they fell sensationally flat. They're outplayed for basically the whole match and were beaten in a lot of key areas by some margin. And in the end, their score was doubled up. They lost by 9 goals and didn't look like winning that game. I think Sydney, I still think people are underestimating Hawthorn. I truly believe that. I know I've been talking them up a lot in the off-season. I'm big on the Hawks, but I still think people are underestimating Hawthorn. I don't think losing to Hawthorn is not a disgrace. Most teams will be losing to Hawthorn this year, I believe. And I don't think Sydney were that bad. I really don't think they were that bad. They weren't great, but they had that period where they showed a bit of fight to get themselves back in the game. We didn't see that from Collingwood at all. I think that was the concern.
And as soon as the conditions changed, it was going to change.
It was always going to be difficult to come back and come back over the top.
And ultimately, the game really wasn't put away until you make a move and have someone classy like Sicily go forward, put a bit of pressure on, score a goal. I get what you mean.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think the Swans at home against a team that finished below them last year versus the Pies away against a team that finished above them last year. It's kind of hard to sort of balance that out depending on your expectations. But
that's the thing. It's all expectation. But I think Collingwood, you can just certainly look at. Christian might have some of the data on the midfield, especially with Nick Dacos, his lack of impact and his cramping in the second half of that game. Obviously, there was no impact. The midfield mix and how that sort of worked, and then the forward line as well, and the worry of. And you don't want to fall in the camp of just overreacting to one loss. Yeah. But should we be concerned about the fact they still don't have that known quantity in the forward line that you can sort of pencil in for a couple of goals? You know what they're getting each week. It's feels like a bit of a lotto, that forward line. You don't know what you're getting.
And we'll talk about it pre-pod. There's probably, we've gone away from having every team having just that outstanding key forward that's going to kick you a bag of goals across the year. So, Hogan's in there for Giants. Carlton have got a couple of them. Yeah, Carlton have got a couple of them. But Hawthorn, Sydney made the grand final last year. Yeah. Brisbane made it with Danaher. Don't have Danaher this year, and no one's writing them off. So you don't necessarily need one. But the third quarter for me, for Collingwood, the numbers in that quarter were concerning. They had 20 inside 50s, failed to take a mark in there. So that's the connection of the two. That's the players sending it in there, probably not being able to find an easy option, but also the forwards just not being able to get out of the way of each other's.
Yeah. And there was rank and accuracy as well. So it's not like, if the ball does hit the ground, where they do have some smalls who are able to do that sort of work, crumbing at ground level.
They have a plethora of them.
Yeah.
But I think that is
4-13, I think, at one point, which is just not going to win you a football game against a good side at home.
Yeah.
Pies midfield, you sort of touched on it. Interesting mix of old and of young at different times, but the Pies were quite old, and we've talked about this coming into this year, and we thought we'd sort of look at the centre bounces in particular.
Yeah.
The Pies most attended, the person who attended the most centre bounces for the Pies was a 37-year-old Scott Pendlebury. And as good as he has been and is, and the sort of player and leadership that he shows, I don't think that's the kind of trend you want to be setting for an entire season if you're a team looking to contend for a flag.
You can't be relying, and I don't think they know that. They know they can't be relying on Scott Pendlebury. Scott Pendlebury, whatever you get from him, he's still playing for his leadership, for what he does, what he brings. Everything about Scott Pendlebury is the outside the ball. You can't have him just trying to be winning the ball. Him getting his hands on the ball first and foremost at every centre bounce. That's not what he's there for. I think it just was it was almost out of necessity. Now, the interesting thing you brought up is Dan Houston. He will come back into the team now. Is he the saviour? Who knows? But he didn't have...
Not one.
So he's a general defender, but we know he pushes up the ground more. He didn't have one single centre bounce attendance in 2024.
Yeah, be more on the wing rather than right in there.
Yeah. So is that something we think might change?
We've seen that Collingwood are going to throw Harry Perryman in there. You talk about general defenders. He's made the move, and he attended a lot of centre bounces.
And I think he showed a lot. I think he showed quite a lot.
And then obviously the caveat being that Dacos halfway through the third quarter was basically ineffective around the ball, around the contest. So they had to place him elsewhere. They brought him off. They pushed him forward and that kind of stuff. But
to go is a big
To go is another one. And so
that's
that's maybe where you can sort of see with the Pies going. But this is a midfield that, on first glance, +1 inside 50s, equal with the stoppage clearances. They were +4 in centre clearances and +24 hit-outs, obviously, because Kieran Briggs went down early in the first term. So the midfield as a whole, you look at that stat line, you go, well, that's
I
interesting.
think on the surface it can look okay, but when
then,
you dig a little deeper...
Oh, someone like Finn Callaghan, who had an absolute breakout game.
Yeah.
Handball receives and ground ball gets, if he got one of those, he got those 11 times when he ran 5 metres or more from a contest. So it just goes to show Collingwood's midfield was not running defensively as strongly as they could have, and whether that's I don't want to say it's an age thing, but a skill or an application thing, whatever it might be, to have a guy who dominated so much be able to kind of burst away from packs and have 5 metres of space. And we talked about separation at contest and at possession. I think that's a massive worry for teams, and teams will look to exploit that.
So from back half scores, it was 64 points to 18. So that's what the biggest difference for the Giants in terms of zone differentials. Their ability to go end to end and move the ball, link up by handball. They had about 600 metres gained from handball to Collingwood's 200. So almost triple as far as just running and carrying it by hand. So yeah, just made them look slow. But yeah, spoke about the centre bounce setup and how we looked at the average age. Obviously Pendlebury lifts that up there, whatever is in there. But you go back to the pre-season against Richmond as well, which they could have taken the second half off, done anything they wanted. Pendlebury and Sidebottom are about 70% of their centre bounces in the pre-season as well. Pendlebury carried that through. Sidebottom wasn't in there as much. But so you look at what they've sort of been able to do, even in that experimental round of the pre-season, they didn't throw any youngsters in there either. So it makes you think. We spoke about De Goey and Houston will come into that, but I think it's finding the other guy, whether Ed Allen, Ned Long, any of these other guys, Bobby Hill maybe get in there, but they've got to find some younger players just to give that point of difference in the midfield. Teams have done it with Dylan Moore, Brent Daniels, those type of guys. So Bobby Hill might be one where you can take off the half-forward line and put into there.
Someone that can just inject a bit of speed and a bit of point of difference.
Which De Goey's an explosive player out of there, but I don't know whether he's got the speed and the nimble feet. But yeah,
Finn Callaghan's not a quick guy. He's an explosive guy. He's got good acceleration.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of player that you kind of want, or you have someone, maybe the Pies or teams coming up against the Giants in weeks coming by, have someone coming up to meet that contest. Make him feel like he's running out of space quickly. Yeah, it was just very interesting to sort of see that mix and the stats and sort of how they sort of broke even in just about everything except the hit-outs, which they won pretty comprehensively. But we know
hit-outs don't equate to winning games of football, as we've discussed many times on this podcast. What do we make it? We shouldn't gloss over. What do we make of the cramping? And it's not so much the cramping because you kind of expect it in the first round of the season, the first game of the season. That's not unusual. What was unusual to me was how early it occurred in the game.
Yep.
In the third quarter.
It was a warm day.
And for particularly, it wasn't just Nick Dacos, so I'm not singling Nick Dacos out, but for a guy that came into the season and still is the clear, overwhelming Brownlow medal favourite, a lot of people believe he is the best player in the league. I certainly think he's a top 3 player. That is shocking to me that he suffered that level of cramping that early into the game of football. I don't know how that happens. I don't know if that's unfair. I don't understand how that can happen.
These guys play match simulation. They train obviously during the summer. So
I don't know if it's a lack of fitness because he's from what we've seen last year, we spoke about it. It'd be 5 minutes to go in a game and he'd be running a 100-metre dead sprint to the wing, outrunning everyone. So it was unusual to see him struggle that early.
But that's what I put a spin on that as well, like not knowing anything about it. He did have a bit of an interrupted pre-season with his foot and stuff. I don't think he's someone that will ease his way back into it. So if he knew that he was running around at 90%, he probably was still going at 100% for that whole first half, and he's just run out of juice in the end. Again, don't know enough about it to make the big call, but I just looked at it as going the other way of he obviously wasn't ready to start the season. But I think a lot of players might know that and might sort of
So look after themselves. So in the off season.
Yeah. So then it begs 2 other questions. Why was he not subbed out of the game if he couldn't move?
They chose to sub out Will Hoskin-Elliott instead. Yeah.
One, because it would have said he wasn't really doing anything at that point, so you weren't getting the benefit of playing him. And 2, it's not so much for Craig McRae to send a message, but it's like we're not afraid to take our best player off if he's either struggling for whatever reason.
You're probably hoping the pickle juice goes to work and you're hoping you can rub it out and you're hoping you can get some production. But it didn't work out that way.
And how does Will Hoskin-Elliott feel?
Damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you're McRae, I can see both points of view.
Yeah.
You can bring him off, and then he might be fine, or the game's a bit closer perhaps.
When
and fans
the
go,
sub-
why are you taking off the best player?
When I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but when that sub was made, if you can tell me, or either you happen to know off the top of your head, I don't think the Collingwood were going to win that game.
Yeah. Good.
I don't think
We'll
it was
have to have a look at
like
that.
I don't think it was if it was. It wasn't like it was a 10-point game and they could still win.
Yeah.
I think I don't know. At some point, maybe you need to conserve him for next week because who's to say it's not going to happen again?
Before we move on, Pies next week have Port Adelaide at the MCG. Houston comes in obviously after serving that suspension, and DeGoey maybe coming in as well.
I mean, not want to know something else. I mean, he's obviously going up against his old side as well.
Yeah.
So
What do you
worked
think?
out well.
Pies? Are we concerned yet, or is it just a...
I'm not concerned. I think it's no matter what happens in round, unless 3 key players did their ACL, I don't think you can have concern. It's one game. I think there's obviously areas that they'll need to work on and fix, and I think they can. Am I confident they're going to beat Port Adelaide? Definitely not. Will I be surprised if they win? Also no.